Hey, welcome back to E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Today we've got, I think, what we're calling an emergency pod because the world is going crazy with tariffs. We have so many brands calling us, and Aaron and I wanted to hop on here just to be supportive, showcase our viewpoints, and just let everyone know what we've been doing to help the companies that Sourcify and ISBA work with. So, Aaron, I mean, there's so much that's happened, in the past, 72 hours a week. I mean, everything is changing dynamically. Where should we start?
Yeah, I think we should probably timestamp this episode. So it's currently the morning of April 10th is when we're recording this. So we've gone through the whole week of will they or won't we? We had the tariffs go into effect and then come off, and so it's just been a crazy thing. I think we start with just like what the heck has happened. So I'd like to get kind of your take on what unfolded. What do you think actually happened here?
Yeah, I mean, so from my perspective, because I saw this happen in 2018 as well, just to less of an extent than what's happening right now. And in 2018, Trump put into place, China-based tariffs because most e-commerce brands are manufacturing in China. Everyone was scrambling to move production outside of China. It wasn't to the extent and speed that these tariffs most recently were implemented. And so I think now, at first, because it was implemented really across, pretty much every nation that we import from, it was almost people were at a loss for words because, like, what do we do? Everything just got so much more expensive to import into the States. I think it was yesterday that the tariffs, besides the one coming from China, were paused. And I think I've heard a lot of different hot takes in terms of reasons. Why is Trump and the administration doing this? Um, you know, uh, Tariffs in general are used to rebalance trade to try to bring manufacturing back to America. I think, from my opinion, most of this you can't necessarily just bring back to America in terms of production. And then I've heard some other kind of hot takes that are compelling, right? I mean, I can dive into those, but it's it's just a crazy time, and I my gut actually told me even before yesterday that tariffs were going to be paused, and I was surprised that they weren't paused from China as well. But I think we're really going neck and neck with China as kind of like a global world leader. And my gut now tells me Trump kind of has a grudge with China in terms of you know them becoming a global superpower.
Yeah, I mean, this has devolved from some sort of semblance of a policy, and I think it's just gotten, in my opinion, worse and worse and less coherent as time has gone on. And I'm not trying to be political about that, but here's how I see things: is we know that there was a stated goal to curb fentanyl, right? That was where this whole thing started. Was we need to close the fentanyl coming into the country. We need to secure the border, all those sorts of things. Well, then it devolved into, we don't like this balance of trade thing that's going on. We are importing too much. We're not selling enough. Let's look at that. And so it's like, okay, if the stated objective is to close the trade deficit, which we'll get to in a minute, if that's even worth focusing on, then it really became, all right. Let's start to tariff everybody. And the formulation that was put together didn't make any sense. And in fact, it was shown that there were a lot of mistakes in this rollout. So not only in the formulation itself, where if the economists who had kind of suggested this white paper said, if you had changed these and use those constants the way they should have been, the tariffs on Vietnam should have been more like 12% instead of 46%. And so there was like they lost a lot of credibility there. And then it was also one of these things where, uh, if it was about the world, then let's have some sort of coherent process or mechanism to say this is how you get the tariffs off. But there wasn't that. It was kind of playing red light, green light with the economy. Are they on? Are they off? Are they maybe on? Are they maybe off? It's like trying to catch somebody that was there. And now we've kind of gotten to a point where this is all about China. And the thing is, like if this was always about China, or it was always about fentanyl, it was always about trade deficit, like we're really kind of moving around on what the focus should be. But if this was the goal, was to try to restrain or restrict China to some extent, why did we pick a fight with the rest of the world? And you look at all of these things that have happened in short order, and by going after everybody, basically you had three major southeastern powers: China, Japan, and South Korea, come together, who normally never come together. They've been rivals and haven't had good feelings for centuries. They've now come together and said they're going to coordinate any responses back, for the U.S. if tariffs were imposed. And if you look at what happened, China came through and raised tariffs and kind of took that lump. But the reason that the tariffs were rolled back, at least in my opinion, was because Japan, who is the largest holder of debt, they held about $1 trillion worth of U.S. debt. They started to flood the market and basically push down all these treasuries. And so you look at this, and the supply was increasing, the interest rates, rather than going down because people were piling into treasuries because it was safe, it was actually going up. And so once you start having long-term treasuries pushing above 5%, the economy starts to break because the government can't fund itself. People can't loan for their businesses or take out loans for their houses. And so I don't know how you could look at this as anything other than a capitulation by the U.S. to walk some stuff back. And I listened to a lot of C-SPAN last night, and I know there was a lot of spinning to try to say this was always the plan, this was things there. And I just don't see it. I want desperately for there to be a coherent plan. And I think we could live with high tariffs if we knew what they were, but it's this on again, off again thing, which is just kind of killing us.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in terms of I don't think there was a cohesive plan because just the speed at which it happened, right? And to see him, go in a matter of, I don't know, 24, 48 hours of saying, hey, we're going to have tariffs everywhere, to, hey, we're pausing all tariffs besides China, it makes people scramble. I think part of it, in my opinion, was maybe, he and his team didn't necessarily realize how the stock market was going to react, because it really, fell off a cliff when tariffs were enacted across the world. And, when he paused tariffs, the market went, straight back up. And so it's kind of crazy to see just that swing. And I think yesterday was the single or maybe third biggest or single biggest increase in the S&P in a single day. And so, it's just crazy to see those market fluctuations. And it makes you wonder, does our government really understand the implications of tariffs on our economy? And, I think it's interesting what you were saying from a interest rate standpoint, because, one of the hot takes that I read was, Trump is a real estate guy, right? And so he has a lot of major donors that are very prominent in real estate. Most commercial loans are, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year loans. A lot of those loans are coming due soon. And, we're not in the ZERP era anymore. Those buildings that his friends own, could be underwater when those loans come due and they have to, get new loans, they have to refinance. And so another take I heard was that he's trying to basically, stifle the economy's growth to pressure the Fed to lower rates. So that way his friends, that are deep in real estate could have lower rates when time comes for them to refinance their loans. And so that was an interesting hot take that I heard that, was compelling in some sense, but now seeing him, pause most of these tariffs, I think I really, now kind of question what is the grand plan here.
Well, I mean, you bring up an interesting point. I don't necessarily know if it was, let's wipe out trillions of dollars so that a few friends can save a couple $1,000,000 on their investment pieces. But I mean, we have, I think, $9 trillion of U.S. debt that needs to be refinanced in the next 6 to 9 months. I mean, it's an enormous amount. And this debt was taken out 5 years ago when it was that ZERC era. And so it was basically free money. Well, now if we're going to refinance it, it's going to be at 4.5%, 5%. And so there has been a conversation that people have had, whether or not this is the policy of the administration is to be seen. But there has been a thought that, okay, let's tank the economy. Let's have the Fed lower rates so we get some stimulus in there so that the government can refinance at a lower rate. I think there's something like if we were to refinance the debt at just 0.5% lower, it's several $100 billion worth of interest that we wouldn't have to pay. And so that's a very real and material thing. And I don't want to minimize, like, the US government, the US economy has major structural problems. And so I think it's right to try to focus and try to fix those. I just don't see how what we've done the last week has aided that at all. I mean, you look at this, we've alienated our allies, we've pushed people more toward China instead of coming away from them. And now it's kind of this question of, what are you going to do? Can you trust anything that the Trump administration says, or can you trust anything that the United States is doing just because of all the free trade agreements and the things that we're doing unilaterally? And so I think that this is a really bad flaw that's been exposed in the system, whether or not you like Trump or not. I mean, having somebody be able to send out a social media post and move the markets by trillions of dollars is not a healthy thing to do. I mean, imagine if let's suppose, we zoom forward and we've got someone else, we go backwards and it's Obama or Biden. And let's suppose someone hacked their Twitter account and just said, I'm now doing these things, and the markets react because of it. Like, that's just too much power for the executive to have. This should really be something that Congress is tied to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think it's the information age, right? The speed at which information moves in today's world is mind-boggling, and it's never, information has never been able to spread this fast before, right? And so, with Twitter and these other social media platforms, I mean, it's just crazy how fast information can spread like that. And I think, even if you go back, probably 15 years, Twitter wasn't around, and a lot of these social media platforms weren't as prevalent. And now just information can spread so quickly that, that's what happens. And, talking about the markets and how social media plays a role, I saw a whole different thread on, people bought, calls when he posted buy, and it seemed like their positions made it seem like they had some insider knowledge. And I know here in the States too, there's a lot going on with the Congress and are they insider trading, etc. But I think in general too, the way that the administration has enacted tariffs make it very hard to trust and plan and manage your supply chain, right? And so I know at Sourcify, we've just been flooded with companies asking us, what do we do? We can't afford these new tariffs. What do we do? And I think we've tried to be as strategic as possible with them to think long term, right? Because, for the most part, it's near impossible to just pick up your supply chain from China and move it to, Vietnam or India or wherever else it may be. We do have some cases with cut and sew factories where we can, do that in a pretty efficient manner, and some other products as well. But I think in general, when you have planned shipments coming in Q2 and Q3 that you've already forecasted, and you forecasted, your pricing and how that's going to reflect your margin, and then all of a sudden that forecast is out the window because you have a new crazy tariff in place, it's really hard to strategize and forecast. And so I think at Sourcify, we've already seen clients kind of say, hey, we're going to, push back some of our orders to see how this plays out. Which I think right now, because it's changing, every hour almost, right? That's a smart thing to do. But I think in the long term, we have seen, even in 2018, we have seen a lot of clients, try to strategize on how do we, move our production outside of China, because this seems to continue to happen every few years in China. But, from my belief, China is still the world's manufacturing hub. They manufacture the vast majority of products that we import. And I think it's very hard to manufacture a lot of those products here in the States or elsewhere. And even then, if we are to manufacture it in other countries, a lot of times the raw material is still coming from there. And so, I think it's been a emotional and just dynamic time for everyone in e-commerce. And it's I've just had some just crazy and fascinating conversations the past week.
Yeah, me too. And I think that it's one of these things that because of the uncertainty, waiting may not be the best strategy either, right? So one of the things that we've encouraged some companies to do is to say, hey, if you needed the inventory, keep placing your orders, like get that factory production there, because you're going to need 20 to 30 days, for it to be produced anyways. And then you can make a decision of, do you hold it at origin, or do you possibly bring it into Canada, which doesn't have this crazy duty stuff going on, and then you hold it there until tariffs either come down and you're able to bring it in at a lower duty rate, or you absolutely need it, so you're going to pay for what you need and kind of be a little bit more just in time. And so, I mean, yeah, you're right. You can't unwind 40 years worth of integration work in 7 days. Like, that just doesn't happen. And we effectively kind of have an embargo going on between the US and China, which I hope is something that is going to be resolved in the next couple of days, because this isn't healthy for anybody. And I guess, kind of zooming out a little bit, Nathan, the focus, at least one of the focuses that the Trump administration has given for all of these tariffs, is the trade deficit. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, is this what actually needs to be fixed, or is this a misguided goal?
I mean, so if you look at it from an economist viewpoint, right? An economist would say you need to produce your products in the country that it can most efficiently be produced in, right? And I think for most e-commerce brands, that in large part is not the US, right? I think, when it comes to other types of manufacturing, whether it be pharmaceutical or, some higher tech production, like, we have new semiconductor facilities being built in the States now, which is pretty exciting. But when it comes to, I think your average e-commerce brand that's producing, jewelry or footwear or, different fashion accessories and home goods, it's very, very challenging to do it at the right cost here in the States. And so I would say, I mean, from an economist standpoint, most of the time doesn't make sense to manufacture these products in the US. Um, you know, of course, tariffs can be used as a tool to get people to explore that and get people to build manufacturing facilities that, can try to uh, bring a lot of those products here to be produced. But at the end of the day, I mean, when you actually look at the supply chain of these products, like let's even talk about something simple like a jacket. You've got the fabric, you've got the trim, you've got the zipper, you've got the collar, like all those different pieces a lot of times are coming from different sub suppliers. And we don't have most of that in the States, right? I mean, the biggest zipper supplier is Japanese. And so I just think it's it's not something that you can do overnight. And the way that these tariffs were enacted made it seem like, oh yeah, we're just going to flip a switch and all these companies are going to start producing here, right? So I find it very just impractical, really.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying here. And let's suppose that that was what was going to happen, right? Let's suppose that having the tariffs high, and we were going to stick with it, no matter what, and that's what it was going to be. There's a few structural problems that the US has in order to bring this back. One is it takes a very long time to build something here. You think about, China's able to put a factory up. I think during COVID, they put up a hospital in like 4 days or something like that. And it isn't because they know how, they have more people or they know how to work it, but it's because our system has so many checks and balances that is inherently slow, right? There are permits, there's inspections, there's environmental regulations, things like that, that are all well intentioned, but it has the downside of basically saying, this is going to take 5 to 10 years to go build something, and let alone it be something that is large and complex and has been done before. And so I think that's the first problem. The second piece is we don't have the energy infrastructure today to power all of these things. We're going to need, several dozen nuclear power plants or an enormous amount of natural gas or coal or wind or things like that. And so we just don't have the electrical infrastructure to power all of this. And the third thing is, like, we need the people to work in this. And so, part of the reason why wages are so low in Asia is because there's a lot of people that want to do this work. And you just look at what's happening with kind of some of the ICE raids where they're cracking down on illegal immigration, which I think is a problem. We should make sure we have a secure border. But there are concerns that farmers will not have support to come pick the crops or take care of the cattle or things like that. And so you look at all these elements and it's all interconnected. And so we need to invest more in the infrastructure here. We need more in terms of uh, some semblance of who's going to do this work. Maybe it's all going to be robots, right? Maybe that's the idea. In which case, we need to be building that muscle here too. And so, I think that if the goal is to be able to make things again, that's important. But we need to have that industrial policy that encourages people to do it, in addition to the threat of tariffs or things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I just go back to 2018, right? When tariffs were enacted then, when they were increased then, I mean, I recall very, very few e-commerce companies that shifted or tried to even shift production back to the States, right? The main conversations we were having were around how do I move my production from China to, Vietnam or India or Pakistan or elsewhere in Asia. It was very rarely, how do I bring my production back to America? Because of many of the reasons that you said in terms of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of a sub supply chain for those products, the lack of labor, and a lot of times too, you talk to even founders of 3PL companies and a lot of them that were partnered with at Sourcify and ISBA. And even them to run a 3PL and staff their warehouses can be a challenge. You've seen even at a much larger scale with Amazon and the challenges they've had with their FBA warehouses and staffing, and now they've got or that's I think a lot of reason why they're really investing in robotics to ease a lot of those staffing challenges that they have at their warehouses. So I mean, from your conversations, have you seen people ask more, how do I bring production back to the States, or how do I move production outside of China?
I think yes to both. So when it looked like tariffs are going to be high everywhere, there was a lot more conversation of, where are we going in the States, right? And I still think that is probably not even the right way to look at it. I mean, there's one example that I'm aware of where there is a modular home factory, we'll call it that was here in the United States that was uh, doing everything right, right. They were making products here. They were getting their steel from Mexico, which now has a 25% tariff on it. And so they're like, man, I'm kind of screwed. What do I do? And the math works out as such that rather than paying the 25%, or buying steel from the U.S., it was actually cheaper to import Chinese steel into the Dominican Republic, which has a 0% tariff coming into the DR, convert that steel into a semi-finished good, which you could then import at 10% with the current tariff there. And so it's like, like I always talk about, supply chain is water. It's going to find a way. And this is a good example of, even though, the thought is like, hey, just come back to the US, it's still not feasible to do that. And this is a worthwhile goal. Like, let me be clear about that. But it's going to take a long time to do that. And it's going to be consistency with several administrations that's what they want to do. And, I don't know if there's a whole lot of value in being able to, uh, create cardboard books for children in the United States, right? Like the ones you read when your kids are going to bed. I don't know if there makes sense to have those produced in Mississippi. But, when it comes to strategic things like automobiles, uh, food, some apparel makes sense. Like there's pieces there where if we believe that the world is going to get less interconnected, and we kind of have to break things up into spheres of influence, then maybe it's there. But then I come back to, we should have Fortress North America, right? The best way to do this and to counteract, China, if that's what we're concerned about, is to have even more integration with Canada and Mexico, and basically, the concept of friendshoring here, where you have all of these countries that are incredibly tied in and dependent, and we still get the benefit of the low cost labor, but we are able to choose to produce the things that we want to produce here in the United States.
Yeah, and that kind of, I guess, ties into some of the second and third order effects that I've seen from different companies, trying to, for example, avoid Section 301 tariffs, both in terms of cost and complexity. I mean, I know, for example, with the de minimis rule, that kind of changed, especially because, Shein and Temu were, getting a lot of bad press about how they were utilizing that. I mean, what have you seen on that front as well? Because, I know at Sourcify, for example, we have a few clients that, warehouse in Mexico and ship through the D- rule into the States. And now that's been affected as well.
Yeah, I think that loophole needed to be plugged. I think anytime you've got a business that's built on a loophole versus actually competing, that's difficult. Kind of funny. So, as you know, I'm currently living in Canada, and there have been some crazy good deals on Temu recently because they don't have the 104% tariff, and so there's a lot of Chinese goods that are flooding into Canada, and it's just like I can get a pair of shoes for $1. Like, wow, okay, like sure, why not? So it's kind of interesting, and I think it's a good example of how other parts of the world are going to benefit from the U.S. taking a step back from that. But in terms of second order and third order stuff, I mean, I think that the part that is really concerning for me is that there has been a breach of trust and faith in working with the U.S. Um, we used to be dependable, right? May not have always been right, may not have always, agreed with everyone, but you kind of knew that the rule of law, you knew that things were going to be somewhat consistent. It was easy to plan around with business. I was at Taekwondo with my kids last night. I was talking to one of the other parents here in Canada, and they just talked about how, how much they feel punched in the mouth and how they don't think that they can go back. And he said, I would much rather sell all of our oil to China right now, as opposed to do anything more with the U.S. And so there's been a really large rift in the relationship and in the fabric of what's there. And I understand playing hardball, and that can be an important thing to do, but you got to get something for it. And so I think that Trump didn't play hardball for long enough, but also has been inconsistent in how he's playing it. That it's kind of like, all right, we're trying to negotiate, maybe, or we're trying to close the fentanyl thing, maybe, but we're not a dependable partner. And so I think the large winner in all this is going to be China, and it sounds kind of crazy right now with the 125% tariffs that are on it today. You're like, oh my gosh, what are they going to do? But if you look at all this, you're already seeing other countries start to be more open to China. And they've recognized the U.S. is unreliable, that the U.S. is looking to change the economic order. And you may not like China, you may not like the politics of what's going on, but they have 5-year plans, they have stability, they have, for the most part, they live by their agreements that they've made from administration to administration. So, I think that there's a real choice that's being propped up where they say, all right, we don't know which way the U.S. is going to go. We kind of know where we're going to get with China. If we have to replace the U.S. market because they're going to tariff us, then the only other place that we can look at is trading more outside of the U.S. and particularly with China.
Right. And I think too, if you look at the trade imbalances of most of these countries, probably from a trade perspective alone, most of them are more reliant on China for their goods than on US made goods, right? So just looking from that lens of trade alone, I mean, I know the US does a lot for other countries globally outside of trade, but just looking at trade alone, they're definitely a lot more reliant on China than the US. So I mean, I tend to agree with you there. I think there's some other strategic moves that the U.S. could make, when it comes to supporting a lot of these countries that are not now leaning more towards China, right? You look like you mentioned Japan as a strong U.S. ally, and how they've now been, in talks with China to align on more trade. I think it's just been a crazy, week. And I mean, today, I mean, we're recording this at 7 a.m. my time, and I'm just curious, what news is going to hit the wire today, because, something's going to come up, something's going to change here between, the U.S. and China. But when it comes to, I guess, companies that are looking to build resilient supply chains because of tariffs, or they're just unsure, how would you try to navigate this, right? Let's say you're the director of supply chain at, Solo Brands, for example, right? They now in the public markets I saw are trading at think their market cap is $8 million, which is just
Wow.
crazy to see how low they've dipped. But I think tariffs had to do a lot with that because, the cost of import for, you know, Chubby's, which produces most of its products in China and other parts of Asia, as well as their Oreo kayaks, most of that is done overseas too. I mean, a lot of these brands are just taking a huge, huge hit, and they're importing, $100+ million of products this year. How would you navigate this storm?
Yeah, as much as this is a scary and volatile time, this is also an opportunistic time. And so what I've been telling people is to not walk through any one-way doors, right? So don't do anything dramatic. Don't fire your team. Don't put your company up for sale. Don't decide to go out of business, because you want to kind of think through things and say, all right, is this a good idea? Should we do it anyways? But you want to give yourself optionality, because the tariffs are red light, green light, and they're on, they're off, and they weren't canceled. They're pushed for 90 days. Now we've got a blanket 10% tariff for pretty much everybody else but China. I think that you need to have some semblance of permanence in order to make decisions several months out, let alone several years out. And so the first thing is, like, don't walk through any one-way doors. I think that it is going to be incumbent upon people to find a second source to China. Doesn't mean you abandon China, but if we are going to be splitting the world between kind of the US camp and the Chinese camp, well, you're going to need to find production, not necessarily in the United States, but in a country that is going to have a preferred proximity or preferred trade balance with the US, preferred tariff rate. And so it might be that you continue to produce in China, and that goes to Australia and Canada and the EU and Southeast Asia. And perhaps you've got a factory in Mexico, and that goes to the US, right? The US market is big enough, and for most companies, it's typically like everywhere else in the US. And so that's really what you're going to look at getting to. But you need that optionality, you need those sorts of things. And so I think working and doing that work now is important, because everybody's starting to look at it. You got to reevaluate it. I think that the third thing is to really think about the optionality that's there. And so we talked about this earlier. Perhaps you continue to produce, but you hold the inventory at origin. I know a lot of brands are going back to factories and saying, hey, if I were to commit to the next 9 months of POs, what discount can you give me, so we have continuity as we're going through? And then, we talked about also is like pulling your inventory into an intermediate country. So if you're producing from China, maybe it lives in the DR, maybe it lives in Morocco, maybe it lives in Canada, and you're able to bide your time, fulfill everything else, but then only import what you need based on where the tariffs are. And so imagine if you had several containers worth of product in Canada right now today that came from China. Well, now that the tariffs are lower, you can bring them in, maybe not from China right now, but once the tariffs do come down, you're able to bring them in pretty quickly, as opposed to, paying what that tariff is as soon as it comes in.
Yeah, I agree in large part with that. I mean, I've had so many friends that run e-commerce companies reach out to me the past week and especially over the past 48 hours. And I think my gut told me that these tariffs were not going to last. I mean, and so I think that has proven to an extent, outside of China. I have told friends, hey, let's really wait to see how this plays out. But I've also told friends to, explore outside of China, right? Because I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge during the Trump administration. I think, he in large part is picking a fight with China, which I personally don't think is a great plan. And so I have, advised companies and friends to, see what does it look like to, get all your raw material from China and work with a assembly plant in Vietnam or, India or the Philippines or, even in the DR or Mexico or other parts of the world. And so, I think that's always an interesting strategic move. Obviously there are added logistics costs to that, but, if you look at your net cost right now with these new tariffs, it makes sense to try to implement that. And I think long term, at least during this administration, I foresee, challenges with China and just continuing to kind of poke the bear, if you will, strategy, which I don't think is a good one at all. And I agree with you in terms of, I've talked to a few friends in Asia, as well as, in Mexico and in Europe. And it these tariffs do not shine a positive light on the US. It makes people kind of have a bad taste in their mouth for the US in terms of, the pressure that we put on their country and government. And, they're always asking why, right? Why do you think this happened? And, you know, I don't know if this was an economic strategy or a political one. I think to me, it seems like it's more political, but I mean, it's just been, I just foresee more challenges in the future, at least during this administration with China, which um, I think we want to be partners in global growth with China rather than competitors.
I completely agree, and it kind of breaks my heart because, like you, I've got friends all over the world, and it's kind of like, I'm sorry, right? I don't even live in the U.S. right now, and I find myself constantly apologizing for what's going on. I think that as we start to look forward and we think about what's next, what do you see as, are these coming back in 90 days, or are we done?
It's a good question. So I think with China, my gut tells me there's still going to be some level of new tariffs staying in place. I don't think it's going to be the level that it is right now. I think there'll be some sort of agreement that, China and the US will lower their tariffs to a certain level that is, that at least a lot of these importers and exporters, because there's now, tariffs in China too, can stomach. Um, but I think it just makes us competitive with China, which we've always been. But I think, really we should be global partners in growth and hopefully have, strong goodwill with them. But obviously over the past decade, that's been challenged, and now it's been challenged even more. And so, you know, people in China are workhorses. I mean, they have the saying 996, 9 to 9, 6 days a week. And, I know a lot of people in China that work 7 days a week and work a lot harder than that. And so I just don't see the majority of our country, being able to work as hard as they do. Um, and I think too, even from a technological standpoint, right? We saw DeepSeek coming out of China with their AI. I don't know if you've seen some of BYD's
Yeah,
new cars, but they look amazing. I mean,
I
some
know.
of
I
the
want one.
technology that they have in their cars are like insane. I mean, for someone that hasn't seen it yet, if you're listening, just Google like BYD new car technology, and like it is very impressive. And so I just think from a global world order standpoint, and even to touch on BYD real quick, the reason why we don't have those vehicles in America in large part is because the tariffs that we would place on Chinese vehicles, right? I mean, they basically, it doesn't make sense for them to export to the US those vehicles, because I think they would, you know, compete head on with Tesla and other electronic or electric vehicle manufacturers. And we know, at least from what I've seen online, BYD seems to produce a better product. Um, and,
SUV that drives through water. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Uh, so I think it's just a really, I just, I don't know. I guess the question that I have, because I can't see it, is what good comes from these tariffs with our relationship with China? Like, do you see any good with our relationship with China?
I mean, no, I don't. I think that we've been focusing on the wrong problem, and I think that Trump has potentially overplayed his hand, and no longer has the cards, to use the expression. Um, what the last week showed us is that the U.S. is can be unreliable, right? It's difficult to trust or to plan based on what's coming through there. And they showed us that the Achilles heel that the U.S. economy has is the deficit. It is the debt, not the trade deficit, but the debt that's there. And if Japan is able to sell a couple $1 billion worth of debt and basically completely upend things and turn things around, like that's a difficult weapon, right? And so you look at this, and China has $800 billion worth of debt. Japan had $1 trillion. About 20% of the total debt is held by foreign governments, which we have now all united, right? We have all now united against us. I think that if the plan was to try to focus on China and to fix that relationship, then the tariff regime right now is actually the one that we should have had, which is really high tariffs on China, low tariffs everywhere else, because now you start to see that, okay, I got to get out of China. Here's all my other options, and I can move through there and step through that. I think when they're high everywhere, you're kind of frozen, you're stuck. You're like, well, now what do I do, right? And so I think that China's also taking some steps where they have started to restrict the exports of rare earths to the U.S., which we need for weapons, electric cars, all those sorts of things. And so that's a very real thing. And we have rare earth access in Ukraine, right? Currently a war zone. Canada, which doesn't like us very much. Greenland, which we're trying to take over. And so there's all these other things where it's like, if the goal was China and we wanted to unite the world and kind of basically say, hey, to work with us, you put tariffs on China and no longer work with them at all, that could have been an outcome that would have made sense, and maybe you balance out, and then maybe you get the concessions that you need. But instead, we tried to fight 300 fronts at once, and we're in a situation where I don't know how we get out of this. Now, I think that while we've taken a black eye in the status of the world, I think one thing that could happen would either be a Supreme Court decision, or better yet, Supreme Court and a constitutional decision that basically reiterates the rule of law and just says, like, we're not doing Trump tariffs by tweet anymore. And so if we were able to do that and to basically wrest some of that executive power away, then I think the rest of the world would start to say, okay, they had that episode, he can't do that anymore, or any future president can't do that anymore. And so therefore, it's a little bit more stable. We can plan off of that.
Yeah, I mean, one question that comes up to my mind as well is, if you look at the global reliance on the U.S. versus China, I mean, it seems like from a trade and manufacturing standpoint, China, produces a lot of the products across the world, right? So if you look at, the EU, right, I would assume that probably most of their imports are coming from China. Now, maybe other countries obviously need the U.S. for our purchase power and our consumers. But, if you look outside of that scope, when it comes to trading partners, it seems like, China is a vital manufacturing partner for pretty much every country in the world. And so I just, I find it hard to fathom how we work our way out of this in a positive light with China, which I think is a poor strategic move, just because I don't think we should try to poke the bear when it comes to competing with China. I mean, I think it's much better to align on certain growth goals and align on certain, technological advances. But, unfortunately right now we are very, very competitive with China, pretty much across the board. And we restrict, a lot of their technology, and they're our global competitive partner. We're just competing with them on every front.
Yeah, well, it goes both ways as well. Like, let's not minimize it. There are very large structural issues between the U.S. and Chinese relationship, and so I think, like, if the goal was to fix those structural issues and to put maximum pressure on China, then we shouldn't have picked on literally every other country in the world, right? And so I think that we seem to be fumbling around and trying to figure things out as things come through. And so I just hope that we don't have any major lasting damage. We can go back to kind of where things were. But again, I think that things need to be improved across the board. Like Trump has some good points about, we haven't done a good job taking care of people who've been displaced by globalization, right? There are certain industries that are strategic that we should bring back and we should have here. We should have some level of reciprocity with countries, but we've got to have a predictable and understandable way to go about this, so that people can know that they're dealing with someone in good faith.
Totally. I agree. Are there any last comments or thoughts around tariffs? I mean, I know what comes to my mind is, if you're an e-commerce founder, really, I think if I was running, let's say, a $10 million a year e-commerce business, I'm importing 2.5, maybe $3 million of goods. This is really hurting my business. I think in the short term, I would just raise prices, right? I think that's something that you've got to do, unfortunately. But, I just don't see another way to really, cushion the shock of your margin. And then I really would explore investing in a supply chain outside of China if you can, even if it means just assembling your product somewhere else. And, that way you hold a maybe stockpile or half a year or more of raw material in another country. That makes it so you're not so at risk to this trade war with China. And I think long term, you can start calling around and seeing if there are any facilities, in America that can produce your products. But, from what I've seen, it's extremely hard to do for most of these categories that these, SMB e-commerce companies are in.
It's not impossible, but it's going to take 3 to 5 years to stand up, right? So you've got to kind of think about what's your plan through the rest of the Trump administration, and then you make a bet to see what's going to continue. I think the last idea that I've been thinking through is this focus on the trade deficit, and there are two ways that you can fix the trade deficit. The first one is you get other countries to buy more. The other way is you buy less. And I think, unfortunately, the path that we're on right now to close the trade deficit is that we will be buying less, and that means that in general our dollars will not go as far. We're going to be poorer as a society, and I think that we've really got to take a look at this, understand what it is that we're trying to solve for, because there's lots of other ways to solve for. Again, if we wanted to go after fentanyl, we've got clear, concrete things that are being done on the northern and southern border. There's still work to do on the southern border. There are some very specific things that China can do to help. Let's talk about that, right? If we care a lot about access to U.S. markets and reciprocity and tariffs, there are ways to go about doing that. I mean, having the threat of tariffs and just saying, hey, we're going to give it 90 days. We're going to meet with every country that wants to. Here's the tariffs we're going to put on unless we can negotiate a deal. And oh, by the way, here's the deal that we want. That could have been so much more straightforward and could have gotten that policy in a much straightforward manner. If we care about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., which I see really as a proxy is let's make sure that everybody's taken care of, then the way to do that would be to not have a carte blanche approach to every industry and making sure that we want to make pencils and erasers and paper clips in the US, but being very strategic and saying we care about semiconductors, we care about automobiles, we care about these other things, and making sure that we have the ability to not just produce what we need here, but to export and to take care of that. You mentioned BYD, and I think like what's going to happen with BYD is eventually they're going to build a factory in the US, right? They're going to get around the tariffs by building a factory in the US and providing jobs here and becoming a US manufacturing company, and we'll get access to those sorts of cars that way. And so I think that there's a lot of other ways that unintended consequences where it's not that restricting BYD suddenly makes Tesla or Chevy Volt more attractive. It just keeps the innovation down. It keeps the competition down. And so I think I'm typically a pretty cerebral guy and try to think through these things logically, but I think that when you're dealing in an illogical environment, the most important thing you can do is just try to stay clear sighted, not make any rash decisions, and understand that any plans you put forward, you may have to walk back.
Totally. It makes, yeah, it's a crazy time in the world. We'll see what happens. We'll probably do another one of these emergency pods here, in the next 48 hours or something as things change. But, as always, ISBA and Sourcefy are here for any brand, whether you need any supply chain help, sourcing help, we've got your back, and we'll get through this together. So thank you for tuning in to this emergency pod of e-commerce on tap, brought to you by Sourcefy and ISBA. And we'll hear from you soon.